Gwen Calloway stood before Frederick Odom opened the folder. The room was small and still the way rooms are still when everyone in them understands that something is about to be decided. 3 chairs on one side of the table, Marcus Gwen, their attorney from Louisville, whose name Nora had not retained. 2 chairs on the other side, Nora and Ruth. Frederick at the head, his reading glasses on the folder closed in front of him. Gwen did not wait for him to open it. She said, "Mr. Odom, before you begin, I'd like to establish something clearly." She opened her own folder, the gesture of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. She said, "Under the will Bernard Calloway executed in 2019, the entirety of the estate, the property at 417 Beaumont Avenue, the savings accounts, and the Fayette County parcel, is directed to Marcus Calloway and family. We'd like today's proceedings to reflect that understanding from the outset." She set a photocopied document on the table and smoothed it with one hand. The room was quiet. Marcus sat beside her and did not look at his mother. Ruth, on Nora's left, found Nora's hand under the table and held it. Nora felt the pressure of Ruth's fingers and did not move. She looked at Gwen. Then she looked down at the handbag in her lap. The envelope had been in the nightstand drawer for 11 years. A plain white envelope, letter size, slightly soft at the corners from time. Bernard's handwriting on the front, the same handwriting she had read on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the inside cover of every book he had given her in 42 years of marriage. "Nora, if this is needed, you'll know when." He had given it to her on the evening of September 15th, 2013. They had been sitting at the kitchen table, the oak table he had built himself in the first year of their marriage, dovetail joints and hand-sanded surface, the table she had graded papers on and corrected essays on and eaten breakfast at every morning for 4 decades. He had slid the envelope across the table. He had said, "Keep this. Don't ask about it. Don't open it unless you need to." She had looked at him. He had looked back at her with the expression she recognized as his finished expression, the face of a man who had thought something through completely and arrived at a decision that did not require further discussion. She had put the envelope in the nightstand drawer without asking. She had not opened it. Not when Marcus began calling more frequently after Bernard's diagnosis. Not when Gwen started referring to the house as the property. Not when the evening Bernard died. Marcus and Gwen arrived with a printed inventory sheet and moved through the rooms, taking photographs of everything they could see. Nora had poured them tea. She had not opened the envelope. This morning before leaving for Frederick Odom's office, she had opened the nightstand drawer and taken it out for the first time. She had held it in both hands for a moment. Then she had placed it in her handbag and driven to Lexington. Gwen was still speaking. She was making a point about the 2019 will, about Marcus's role as primary beneficiary, about the family's intention to handle the estate efficiently. She used the word efficiently twice. She had the vocabulary of someone who had prepared the argument in advance and was delivering it from memory. Nora was a teacher of language, 35 years of it. She had spent her professional life teaching students that every word carried weight, that a sentence did not mean what you wanted it to mean, but what it actually said, that the difference between 2 near synonyms could change everything. She had taught that to hundreds of students over 3.5 decades. Bernard had understood that about her. He had written on the inside cover of the English textbook he gave her the year they married, "For the woman who taught me that language matters every word, every comma, every sentence." She had brought that book with her today. It was in her handbag beside the envelope. No one had asked about it. She waited until Gwen paused to turn a page. Then she took the envelope from her handbag and placed it on the table in front of Frederick Odom. Not with force, not with announcement. She set it down the way you set down something that does not need introduction lightly, with the certainty of something that has been waiting a long time to be exactly where it is. Frederick looked at the envelope. He looked at Nora. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, what is this?" Nora said, "Open it," and read the first sentence aloud, "Mr. Odom." Just the first sentence. "I believe that will be sufficient." Frederick Odom picked up the envelope. The room was very quiet. Bernard died on a Tuesday morning in October. By 7 that evening, Marcus and Gwen were at the door. Nora had changed out of the clothes she had worn to the hospital. She was in the kitchen when she heard the knock, standing at the counter, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the way you stand in a room that has become unfamiliar in the last several hours without any of the furniture having moved. She answered the door. Marcus embraced her. She held him for a moment. Gwen stood behind him with a coat over her arm and a small stack of papers in her hand. Nora said, "Come in, I'll make tea." She went to the kettle. Behind her, she heard them moving through the front hallway into the living room, the sound of two people orienting themselves in a space they were assessing. Gwen's heels on the hardwood. A pause. The particular silence of someone looking at something and writing. Nora filled the kettle and set it on the burner and did not turn around. She carried 3 cups to the living room on a tray. Gwen was standing in the center of the room with a pen in her hand and the small stack of papers open to a page with lines on it. She had written several things down already. Bernard's reading chair, the side table with the brass lamp, the bookcase along the east wall that Bernard had built the same summer he built the kitchen table, same joints, same hand sanding, same patience. Gwen said, "We just want a general overview to help you start organizing everything." Nora set the tray on the coffee table. She said, "Thank you. Put that stack of papers here, the tea is hot." Gwen set the papers down on the corner of the coffee table. Nora set a cup of tea on the exact corner of the stack without looking at it. She did not look at it for the remainder of the evening. She did not look at it when she cleared the cups. She did not look at it when she said goodnight at the door. She did not look at it when she came back to the living room afterward and stood alone in the room and looked at Bernard's chair. She left Gwen's papers on the coffee table and went to bed. 3 weeks moved in the way the weeks after a death move, full and empty, at the same time ordinary tasks made strange by their ordinariness. Gwen called Frederick Odom's office on the Thursday of the first week. Nora learned this afterward from Frederick's assistant, who mentioned it in passing. Gwen had called to inquire about the timeline for the will reading. She had not called Nora first. She had called the attorney directly, as if the sequence were already settled, as if Nora were a detail to be managed rather than a party to be consulted. Nora did not say anything about this when she learned it. In the second week, Marcus came alone on a Sunday afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table, the oak table, Bernard's table, and drank coffee and talked about practical matters. At the end of the visit, in the careful voice he used when he had prepared something to say, he suggested that the house might be a great deal to manage alone. He said the word alone twice. He mentioned a smaller property near his neighborhood. He mentioned that the transition could be handled gradually, that there was no pressure. Nora said, "Thank you for thinking of me." Marcus looked at her. She smiled at him, the way she had smiled at students who had given an answer that was almost correct and needed to think a little longer. He left without pressing the point. The third week, Gwen sent an email. Attached was a spreadsheet. Every item of note in the house organized by room with a column for disposition. 3 options per row, keep, donate, sell. Several rows already had marks in the column. The email was addressed to Nora. The subject line read, "Organization helping you move forward." Nora opened the email. She read it once. She closed her laptop. That evening she sat at the oak table in the kitchen and thought about the nightstand drawer in the bedroom, the white envelope. 11 years of it sitting exactly where she had put it, undisturbed, waiting with the patience of something that knew it would be needed eventually. Not yet, she thought, but soon. The letter from Frederick Odom's office arrived on a Wednesday. A formal notice of the will reading date, Thursday of the following week, 10 a.m. That same afternoon, before she had set the letter down, her phone rang. An unfamiliar number, Frankfurt prefix. She answered. The woman said, "Mrs. Calloway, my name is Celeste Prudhomme. I'm an attorney in Frankfurt. Bernard asked me to call you if you received a letter from a Mr. Frederick Odom." Nora stood in the kitchen with the letter in one hand and the phone in the other. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand. Celeste said I'll be in Lexington next Thursday morning. Nora said I'll see you there." She set the phone on the table. She set the letter beside it. She looked at the oak table, the grain of it, the surface Bernard had made smooth with his hands in the first year of their marriage, the table at which he had slid a white envelope toward her 11 years ago and said, "Don't open it unless you need to." She thought 1 more week. She could wait 1 more week. She had waited 11 years. The house was quiet by 8. Nora had eaten a small dinner, washed the dishes, and turned off the lights in the front rooms, the way she always did in the evenings, working from the front of the house toward the back, until only the kitchen light was on. It was a habit from 42 years of the same evenings, and she saw no reason to change it now. She sat down at the oak table. The white envelope was in the nightstand drawer in the bedroom. She had known all evening that she was going to get it. She had made dinner first and washed the dishes first because she was not a woman who left things undone in order to get to the next thing faster. She finished what she started. Bernard had always said that about her, not as a critique, as a description. "You finish what you start, Nora. It's the most important thing about you." She went to the bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer. The envelope was exactly where she had placed it 11 years ago, slightly soft at the corners from time, Bernard's handwriting on the front still clear. She had dusted around it when she cleaned. She had moved it once briefly when she replaced the drawer liner and placed it back in the same position. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the oak table in the warm circle of the overhead light. She sat down. She looked at his handwriting for a while. "Nora, if this is needed, you'll know when." She had known, she realized, for several weeks. She had known when Gwen stood in the living room with a pen in her hand the evening Bernard died. She had known when the call came from Frankfurt. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to confirm it, the way you wait to speak in a classroom until the room is ready to hear. She opened the envelope. Inside, a folded sheet of paper and a smaller slip the size of an index card. She took out the index card first. Bernard's handwriting smaller than the envelope inscription, the handwriting of a man writing quickly because the thought was already complete and only needed recording. "Read this in front of Frederick Odom, not before. Celeste Prudhomme, 502448771, will bring a certified copy if needed." She set the card down. She unfolded the sheet of paper. It was 1 page, handwritten in full, Bernard's careful script, not hurried, every letter formed. At the top, in the same hand, holographic codicil to prior will. Below that, a date, September 14th, 2013. Below that, one sentence. She read it. She read it again. Then she set the page flat on the oak table and placed her hands on either side of it and looked at the sentence the way she had looked at student essays for 35 years, not for what she wanted it to say, but for exactly what it said. "I hereby designate Nora May Calloway as the sole beneficiary and sole executor of my entire estate, including the property at 417 Beaumont Avenue, all savings accounts, and the Fayette County parcel, regardless of any document signed after this date." She read it aloud quietly to the kitchen, to the table Bernard had made with his hands in the first year of their marriage. Her voice was the voice she used in the classroom when she read a passage she wanted students to hear correctly, steady, unhurried, each word given its proper weight. 1 sentence. She had taught for 35 years that a single sentence, correctly constructed and precisely placed, could contain everything that needed to be said. She had taught that to students who wrote in circles and qualifications, and excess who believed that more words made a stronger argument. Bernard had known that about her. She folded the codicil carefully along its original crease, the way she folded student papers that needed to be returned without damage. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. "Yes?" Celeste answered on the second ring. Nora said, "Mrs. Prudhomme, I've opened the envelope." Celeste said, "I thought Bernard would give it to you sooner or later. Have you read it through?" Nora said yes.
Celeste said, "Do you need me to explain anything?"
Nora said no. "I understand every word. I only need you to bring a certified copy to Mr. Odom's office tomorrow morning." Celeste said, "I'll be there at 9:30. A pause on the line. Then Celeste said, "Mrs. Calloway, Bernard told me something when he left the envelope with me in 2013. He said, 'Celeste, Nora teaches English. If anyone in that room understands exactly what that sentence means, it will be Nora.'" Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the codicil on the oak table, then at the bookshelf in the living room doorway where the English textbook Bernard had given her the year they married stood between 2 heavier volumes worn spine the cover she had looked at for 4 decades. "For the woman who taught me that language matters every word, every comma, every sentence. Same man, same belief. One written in the first year of their marriage, one written 40 years later. Both trusting her to read correctly. She said Bernard always knew. Celeste said he always did. Nora said goodnight and set the phone on the table. She sat for a while longer in the kitchen light with the codicil in front of her and the house quiet around her and Bernard's table solid under her hands. Tomorrow she would carry this sentence into a room where people believed they had already won. She would wait for the right moment. Then she would ask Frederick Odom to read it aloud. Frederick Odom's office was on the third floor of a building on Main Street that had been renovated twice since Bernard and Nora had moved to Lexington. The waiting room smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee. His assistant showed them in at 5 minutes to 10. The conference table seated 8. Nora and Ruth took the 2 chairs on the window side. Marcus and Gwen sat across from them, their Louisville attorney, a man named Pryor, whose last name Nora had read on his business card and not retained at Gwen's left. Frederick sat at the head, his folder closed, his reading glasses on the table beside it. Tina Marsh, his associate, sat at the foot with a legal pad. Nora set her handbag on her lap. In the back row of chairs along the wall, a woman in a gray blazer sat with a document folder on her knees. She had arrived before anyone else. No one had introduced her. No one had asked. Frederick said, "I think we're ready to." Gwen stood up. "Ike!" She had prepared carefully. Nora could see that in the first few seconds, the way Gwen opened her folder to a marked page, the way she had organized her points so they moved in a clean line from premise to conclusion. She had the cadence of someone who had rehearsed this in front of a mirror. She said, "Mr. Odom, before we begin, I want to establish the framework for today's reading." She placed a photocopied document on the table and turned it to face Frederick. She said, "Under the will Bernard Calloway signed in 2019, witnessed by Marcus Calloway, and myself prepared by your office, the entirety of the estate is directed to Marcus Calloway and family, the property at Beaumont Avenue, the savings accounts, the Fayette County parcel. We'd like today's proceedings to reflect that disposition from the outset so we can move through the details efficiently." She said the word efficiently the same way she had said it before, with the confidence of someone who had used the right word and knew it. Marcus nodded at each point. Pryor made a note. Tina Marsh's pen moved across her legal pad. Frederick sat with his hand resting on his closed folder and did not speak. Nora watched Gwen. She did not interrupt. She did not shift in her chair. Ruth's hand found hers under the table and she held it without squeezing. She listened to Gwen's argument the way she had listened to student presentations for 35 years, fully without reaction, hearing not just what was being said, but what was being assumed. Gwen assumed the room had already agreed with her before she walked in. Nora had spent a career teaching students that assumption was where arguments collapsed. When Gwen sat down, the room waited a moment. Then Nora reached into her handbag. She took out the white envelope. She set it on the table in front of Frederick Odom. Not with force, the gesture of someone placing something in its correct location. She said, "Mr. Odom, open that and read the first sentence aloud, please. Just the first sentence. I believe that will be sufficient." Frederick looked at the envelope. He looked at Nora. Something in her expression steady, unhurried, the expression of a woman who had waited 11 years for this specific moment and was not going to waste it, made him reach for the envelope without asking a clarifying question. He opened it. He removed the single folded sheet. He unfolded it and looked at it. His eyes moved to the top of the page, the heading, the date, then down to the body. There was very little body. One sentence clear and unhurried in Bernard's handwriting. He turned the page over, looking for continuation. There was no continuation. One page, one sentence. A date, September 14th, 2013, and at the bottom, the raised impression of a notary seal, Franklin County, Kentucky. He looked at Nora. She gave a small nod, the nod of a teacher indicating you may proceed. He read, "I hereby designate Nora May Calloway as the sole beneficiary and sole executor of my entire estate, including the property at 417 Beaumont Avenue, all savings accounts, and the Fayette County parcel, regardless of any document signed after this date." His reading voice was a lawyer's voice, measured neutral, each phrase given equal weight. But Nora heard the slight deceleration at the end of the sentence, the place where the meaning arrived, and the voice without intending to acknowledge it. Regardless of any document signed after this date, he stopped. He looked up. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when everyone in them has understood something at the same moment. Tina Marsh's pen had stopped moving. Marcus was looking at the table. Gwen looked at the page in Frederick's hand, then at Frederick. Then she said, "That isn't valid." Frederick set the page down carefully. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'll need time to review this properly, but from what I'm looking at, this appears to be a holographic codicil meeting the requirements under Kentucky law. It's handwritten in full signed, dated, and notarized." Gwen said Bernard signed a will in 2019. That supersedes. From the back of the room, a chair moved. The woman in the gray blazer stood up. She walked to the table and set a document down beside Frederick's folder, a certified copy notarized with a cover letter on her firm's letterhead. She said, "Celeste Prudhomme, Frankfurt. I prepared the codicil in September 2013. I've held the certified copy in my vault since that date. Mr. Calloway retained me specifically for this purpose." She sat back down. The room was quiet again. On the table, the single handwritten page sat beside Frederick's 22-page typed document, one sentence against everything Gwen had prepared. Nora looked at the codicil. She thought about her first year of teaching, the lesson she had returned to every year, the one she gave in the first week because it set the foundation for everything that followed. The shortest sentences are sometimes the strongest ones. 3 words, 4 words, 5 words. If they are the right words in the right order, nothing longer can undo them. She had taught that to hundreds of students. Bernard had listened. Frederick asked for 15 minutes. He said it in the tone of a man who needed to think, rather than a man who needed to stall. The distinction was clear to Nora, who had spent 35 years reading the difference between students who were lost and students who were processing. Frederick was processing. Marcus and Gwen stepped out with Pryor. The associate Tina Marsh followed, closing the door behind her. Ruth stayed. Celeste stayed. Nora stayed. Frederick looked at Celeste over the top of his reading glasses. He said, "I don't believe we've been introduced." Celeste said, "Celeste Prudhomme. I practice in Frankfurt. Bernard Calloway retained me in September of 2013. I'm here at his instruction." Frederick looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the certified copy she had placed on the table. He picked it up and began reading it with the careful lateral movement of a man checking every word against what he already knew. The room was quiet. Ruth leaned slightly toward Nora and said nothing. The silence between them was the silence of 30 years of friendship, the kind that did not require filling. After a few minutes, Frederick set the certified copy down and looked at Celeste again. He said, "Can you tell me the circumstances of the preparation?" Celeste folded her hands on the table. She said Bernard came to my office in Frankfurt on the morning of September 14th, 2013. He didn't have an appointment. He walked in and asked to see an attorney, and I happened to be between meetings. She said he sat down and said he needed help writing one sentence. Those were his words, one sentence. He said he needed it to be durable, his word. He said he needed it to hold against anything he might sign afterward. Frederick said, "Did he explain why?" Celeste said, "Not fully. He said he understood his family. He said he was not angry about it. He used that word specifically, not angry. He said he simply wanted to be certain about one thing before anything else happened." She paused. She said, "We worked for about 2 hours. I explained the requirements for a holographic codicil under Kentucky law. He understood quickly. He was a precise man, an engineer. He grasped the structure immediately. Then he wrote the sentence himself. Not a draft I prepared. He wrote it. I reviewed it for legal sufficiency. He made one adjustment to the word order. Then he signed it, and we had it notarized the same afternoon." Frederick said the $400 payment. Celeste said personal check, separate account. He told me the account wasn't one his family had access to. He wrote the check at my desk, and I have the copy. She opened her folder and placed a photocopy on the table. A check in Bernard's handwriting. Legal Services, C. Prudhomme. September 14th, 2013. Ruth looked at Nora. She said quietly, "Did you know when he did this?" Nora said not the date, but I know why. Ruth said why. Nora looked at the oak table and the memory she kept of that evening, the way it had looked in the autumn kitchen light, the soup Bernard had made the ordinary Tuesday that had contained something she had not understood until now. She said, "In 2013, my sister." She stopped. "Ruth, my sister lost her house in a way she didn't see coming. I didn't tell Bernard the details, but he saw how I was for those months. He asked enough to understand without asking more than I could give." Ruth was quiet. Nora said he didn't do this because he was afraid of Marcus. He did it because he saw me watching my sister, and he understood something that I hadn't said aloud. She looked at the codicil on the table. She said that was always how Bernard worked. He saw the load-bearing element and he addressed it, before anything else. Frederick had been listening. He set down his pen and looked at Celeste. He said, "When Bernard left your office that day, did he say anything?" Celeste was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone locating a specific memory. She said he said one thing at the door. I wrote it down because I thought it was worth keeping. She opened her folder again. A small page of handwritten notes dated September 14th, 2013. She read, "Nora teaches English. She knows that language matters more than almost anything. I want to give her what she teaches, one right sentence strong enough to stand alone." The room was still. Nora looked at Celeste. She did not speak. She was a teacher, and teachers learned early to hold their faces steady through the difficult parent meetings and the failing grades and the moments in the classroom when something landed that you had not expected to land. You held still and let the moment be what it was. She held still now, but her hand moved. She placed it on the codicil where it lay on the table lightly, the way you place a hand on the shoulder of someone you love when words are not the right instrument. One page, one sentence. Bernard's handwriting steady and precise, the hand of a man who had built things meant to last and understood that the same principle applied to language. He had wanted to give her what she taught. She had spent 35 years telling students that a single sentence correctly made could hold against anything. He had believed her. He had walked into a stranger's office on a Tuesday in September with $400 and 2 hours and the absolute conviction that his wife was right about language, and he had written her one sentence that had sat in a nightstand drawer for 11 years, waiting to do exactly what he had built it to do. Frederick picked up his reading glasses. He said, "I'm going to need a few more minutes before we continue. But Mrs. Calloway, I want to be clear about what I'm looking at. This document appears to meet every requirement for validity under Kentucky law." Nora said, "I know." She said it the way she said things she had known for a long time. Marcus and Gwen came back at 10:35. Pryor held the door. Gwen went to her chair with the movement of someone who had made a decision in the hallway and was carrying it back into the room. She sat down, placed her folder in front of her, and looked at Frederick. She said, "We've consulted with our attorney. Our position is that the holographic codicil was produced under the undue influence of Nora Calloway, and that the 2019 will represent Bernard's clearest and most recent expression of his wishes." She said it evenly, the voice of a woman who had prepared a second argument for the case the first one didn't hold. Frederick took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He said, "I want to address that carefully because I think it's important that everyone in this room understands the legal position clearly." He opened his folder to a tabbed page. The first point Frederick said is the undue influence claim. For undue influence to invalidate a testamentary document, the influence must have operated on the testator at the time of signing. Bernard Calloway signed this codicil on September 14th, 2013. He was 57 years old. There is no record of any medical condition affecting his capacity at that time. He traveled to Frankfurt, independently retained Celeste Prudhomme independently, and paid from a personal account that was separate from joint household accounts. Ms. Prudhomme, who prepared the document, had not met Nora Calloway at the time of signing and did not meet her until 3 months later. He paused. He said, "There is no surface on which an undue influence claim attaches to this document." Gwen said the 2019 will was signed in front of witnesses. It postdates. Frederick said that's the second point. He turned to another tab. He said under KRS section 394.080, a later will revokes a prior will only if the revocation is express meaning. The later document states clearly that it revokes all prior testamentary instruments, or if the two documents are so entirely inconsistent that they cannot be read together. I drafted the 2019 will. I know its language. It does not contain an express revocation clause sufficient under Kentucky law to override a prior codicil. And a codicil by its nature is not a separate will. It is a modification of the existing testamentary scheme. He looked at Gwen. He said the 2019 will cannot revoke what the codicil established because the 2019 will does not explicitly and unambiguously address the codicil. The room was quiet. Frederick picked up the codicil. He read the last clause aloud, slowly, the way a man reads something a second time because he wants the room to hear exactly what the words say. He said regardless of any document signed after this date. He set it down. He said Bernard Calloway wrote that clause knowing with the precision of an engineer that he might sign other documents after September 14th, 2013. He included that language specifically to address that circumstance. This is not ambiguous. This is not accidental. This is a man writing a sentence that anticipated exactly what is in front of us today. Carl Briggs, Gwen's attorney, leaned toward her. He spoke quietly, but the room was small enough that the words reached Nora without effort. He said, Gwen, that last clause, regardless of any document signed after this date, a person doesn't write that without intending it. He knew there would be something after. He wrote the sentence to outlast it. Gwen looked at the codicil, 1 page, 1 sentence. Then she looked at the 2019 Will 22 type pages tabbed and marked the document she had arrived with this morning, believing it was sufficient. Frederick had placed the codicil on top of the will at some point in the last few minutes. A practical gesture, he was referring to it, but the image held. 1 handwritten page on top of 22 typed ones. Gwen was quiet for the first time since she had stood up at the beginning of the meeting. Not the quiet of preparation, the quiet of a woman who had reached the end of her prepared material and not found another page. Marcus looked at his mother. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since the codicil had been read. Nora looked back at him. She did not look at him with anger. She did not look at him with the expression of someone who had won something. She looked at him the way she had looked at students who had worked through a difficult passage and arrived finally at what it meant with the patience of someone who had always known they would get there eventually and was simply waiting for them to arrive. Marcus held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Gwen. He said, Gwen. 1 word. Gwen looked at him. He said, stop. The room was quiet. Gwen looked at the codicil on top of the will. She looked at Celeste Prudhomme sitting at the back of the room with her folder closed on her lap. She looked at Frederick, who was watching her with the neutral expression of a man who had already written his notes and was waiting for the meeting to catch up to what the documents had already decided. She closed her folder. She did not say anything. Outside the window on Main Street, an ordinary Thursday in Lexington continued without awareness of what had just ended in a third-floor conference room, quietly without drama, the way things end when the right sentence has finally been read aloud to the right room. Carl Briggs gave a small nod. It was the nod of a lawyer who had reviewed the material and arrived at the same conclusion the material required. He said nothing. He closed his own folder. Gwen watched him do it. She set her folder on the table. She did not say anything. Frederick looked around the table, at Gwen's closed folder, at Pryor, who had stopped writing, at Marcus, who was looking at the surface of the table with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive. Frederick said, I'll need to complete the formal process. There are procedural steps that have to be followed, regardless of what's before us today. But I want to be direct. Based on what I'm looking at, I don't see grounds for continuing a dispute. The codicil appears valid. The language is unambiguous. I'll be in touch with all parties within the week. He set his reading glasses down. The meeting had ended without anyone declaring that it had ended. Nora looked at the codicil. It was still on the table in front of Frederick, the single handwritten page lying on top of the 22 typed ones. Bernard's handwriting in the overhead light of a conference room on a Thursday morning, 42 years after he had first picked up a pen to write something for her. She did not smile. She did not look at Gwen. She did not look at Marcus. She stood up and walked to Frederick's end of the table. She picked up the codicil with both hands. Carefully, the way you pick up something that has been doing important work and deserves to be held correctly now that the work is finished. She looked at the sentence one more time. Then she folded it along the original crease, the crease Bernard had made when he folded it the first time 11 years ago before he placed it in the envelope. She slid it back into the white envelope. She put the envelope in her handbag. Celeste came forward as Nora was fastening the clasp. She extended her hand. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, Bernard would be pleased." Nora shook her hand. She said he was pleased in 2013, Mrs. Prudhomme. Wasn't he? Celeste looked at her for a moment, the look of someone hearing something said that they had been thinking without saying. She said, "He told me something when he left my office that day. He said, I know Nora won't open the envelope until it's the right time. That's why I'm trusting her with it." Nora held that for a moment. She had not opened it when Marcus started calling more frequently. She had not opened it when Gwen brought the inventory sheet. She had not opened it through the months of careful maneuvering and polite pressure and the slow accumulation of assumptions about what was already decided. She had opened it the night before because that was when she had known. She said, "Thank you for coming." She picked up her handbag. She picked up the English textbook from the chair where she had placed it at the beginning of the meeting. Ruth stood and fell into step beside her. "Ah!" At the door, Nora stopped. She did not turn around. She did not look back at the table or the people still sitting at it or the 22-page will lying on the table with one handwritten page on top of it. She stood at the threshold for a moment with her hand resting on the cover of the textbook. The cover was worn. 35 years of it in classrooms in the handbag she carried to school every morning on the desk where she had written her lesson notes. The spine had been repaired twice. The corners had softened with handling. The pages inside still held her margin notes from the first year she had used it, and Bernard's notes in the margins she had found after he died, his handwriting in pencil careful and light in the passages he had wanted to remember. She had found the underline when she was going through his things. Emily Dickinson. Blue pen. The line drawn before 2013, before Frankfurt, before the codicil drawn in the years when he was simply a man reading his wife's textbook because he wanted to understand what she taught. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. She had told her students it was about indirection, about approach, about the angle of honesty. Bernard had read it differently. He had read it as instruction: find the fewest words that carry the whole weight. Find the sentence that cannot be argued with. Write it down. She said it quietly to the book, to the door, to no one in the room, and to one person who was no longer in it. She said, "One sentence contains the whole truth, the briefest, most direct it can be." A pause. She said, "Bernard remembered." Then she stepped through the door and walked down the hallway with Ruth beside her toward the elevator and the ordinary Thursday waiting outside. The house was quiet when she got home. She set her handbag on the table by the door. She took the English textbook from her bag and placed it on the shelf where it had always been, the second shelf between the dictionary and the collected poems, the spine facing out, the way it had faced out for 35 years. She went to the kitchen. The oak table was there the way it was always there. She did not think about this consciously. She simply walked to her chair, the one on the window side that looked out at the garden, and sat down. The garden was bare in the November light. The forsythia along the back fence was stripped, the hydrangea cut back to its winter shape. Bernard had planted the forsythia in their 3rd year in the house. He had planted it because she had mentioned once, without particular emphasis, that she liked the way it looked in March. He had not mentioned that he remembered. He had simply planted it the following spring. She reached into her handbag and took out the white envelope. It was open now. The flap folded back, the interior empty. She had carried it this way since leaving Frederick Odom's office, the codicil folded inside the envelope closed over it, and then in the elevator she had slid the codicil out and placed it in the interior pocket of her coat where it would be flat and protected. The envelope was just the envelope now. She held it in both hands and read Bernard's handwriting on the front. Nora, if this is needed, you'll know when. She thought about 11 years. 11 years of this envelope in the nightstand drawer lying in the same position she had placed it the evening Bernard slid it across this table. She had dusted around it. She had moved it once to replace the liner and put it back. She had opened the drawer on ordinary evenings looking for other things and seen it there and closed the drawer. She had not been waiting exactly. She had simply been living the evenings at this table, the grading and the lesson plans and the conversations with Bernard about her students, his projects, the ordinary accumulation of a life shared without ceremony. And the envelope had been there all of those evenings in the drawer patient, in the way that things are patient when they have been made correctly and placed in the right hands. She set the envelope flat on the oak table. The grain of the wood was visible beneath it. Bernard had sanded this table by hand in the garage over 2 winter weeks, working in the evenings by a clip-on lamp, and when he had brought it into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and asked where she wanted it, she had said there, that spot, the one under the window, and he had set it down, and it had not moved since. He had said a good table is one you don't have to worry about going anywhere. She had thought he was talking about the table. She heard her phone ring in the other room. She let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, it rang again. "Ruth," she answered. Ruth said, "Nora, are you all right?" Nora said, "I'm all right, Ruth. I'm sitting at the kitchen table." Ruth said, "Bernard's table." Nora said, "That one." A pause on the line. Ruth's pauses had specific textures after 30 years. This one was the pause of someone who understood and was deciding whether understanding was enough or whether presence was needed. Ruth said, "Do you want me to come over?" Nora said, "No, thank you. I'm genuinely all right. I just need to sit with him for a little while." Ruth said, "Call me later." Nora said she would. She set the phone on the table and looked out at the bare garden. She thought about the nightstand drawer. For 11 years it had held the envelope. She had organized everything else in that drawer over the years, moved things in and out, cleared the clutter that accumulated, replaced the liner. The envelope had been the one constant, the fixed point around which everything else arranged itself. Now it was empty. She would not put anything in it to replace what had been there. She had thought about this on the drive home, not as a decision exactly, but as a recognition. The drawer had held the envelope because the envelope needed to be held. Now the work was done. Some spaces were correct when they were empty. She looked at the envelope on the table. She said it quietly, to the table, to the kitchen, to the man who had built them both, the table with his hands, the sentence with his handwriting, both in the first years of things that turned out to last. She said, "You built this table in the first winter we were married. You said a good table is one you don't have to worry about going anywhere." She paused. She said, "I don't think you were talking about the table." She folded the empty envelope along its length gently, the way she folded a student's paper when the work was finished and deserved to be handled with care. She set it on the table. Outside the window, the last of the afternoon light was moving across the bare garden, crossing the forsythia Bernard had planted in their 3rd year, because she had mentioned once without emphasis that she liked it in March. He had heard her. He had always heard her. The house settled into evening the way old houses do. Nora made tea. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity, the kettle, the cup, the drawer where the tea had always been kept. Small actions that did not require thought, which was why she did them. Her hands knew where everything was. She let her hands lead and her mind rest. She brought the cup to the table. She went to the shelf and took down the English textbook. She carried it to the table and set it down and opened it to the page she had taught every year for 35 years. The page with the Dickinson poem. The page where the spine had a slight outward bow from decades of opening to this exact place. She sat down. The overhead light was warm and low. Outside the kitchen window, the garden had gone to dusk, the forsythia a dark shape along the back fence, the hydrangea a low mound, the lawn holding the last gray light of the October evening. She looked at the page. Bernard's blue pen underline was still sharp. After all these years, he had pressed firmly the way engineers marked things they meant to keep. The line ran the length of the sentence without wavering. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. She had taught that line for 35 years. She had explained it differently to different classes over the decades, sometimes as a lesson about indirection, sometimes about compression, sometimes about the relationship between form and meaning. But always she had come back to the same central point. The right sentence does not need support. It stands because it is true and because it was made correctly. Beside the underline in pencil so faint she had almost missed it the first time Bernard's handwriting in small, careful letters. She read it again now. Nora taught this line for the first time October 3rd, 1988. I heard it through the classroom door that day. I have remembered it since. She sat with that for a long time. October 3rd, 1988. She had been 37 years old. Her first year with the 11th grade, her first year with this particular textbook. She had not known Bernard yet. She would not meet him until 2 years later at a dinner hosted by a colleague, a Friday evening in the spring of 1990. When he had told her years into their marriage that he had heard the Dickinson line before he knew her, she had asked which class he had been in. He had said he hadn't been in any class. He had been in the building on a work call, an electrical issue in the humanities corridor, and the classroom door had been open, and he had stopped in the hallway to listen. She had not known until now what he had done with what he heard. He had written it in pencil in the margin of a book he had not yet given her, in a book that did not yet belong to either of them, fixing the date the way an engineer fixes a measurement, not because he expected to need it, but because precision was a habit, and this was something he wanted to have correctly recorded. October 3rd, 1988. He had walked past an open classroom door and heard a woman explain that the right sentence did not need anything else around it. He had not known that woman's name. He had written the date in the margin of a thought he was still carrying. 2 years later, he had met her at dinner. 25 years after that, he had driven alone to Frankfurt and sat down with a stranger and written one sentence in his own handwriting and paid $400 from an account no one else could access and driven home and made soup and placed a white envelope on the oak table without explanation. He had given her what she taught. She had taught him the principle in 1988 through an open door before she knew he was listening. He had carried it for 25 years and then used it to protect her. She set her hands around the teacup. On the table, the open textbook, the pencil notation, the folded white envelope. Outside the garden, going dark. Inside the house Bernard had filled with things he built with his hands, the table, the bookshelves, the kitchen cabinets with the dovetail joints she had not noticed until she had known him long enough to look. She whispered it to the book, to the page, to the pencil notation in the margin. She said October 3rd, 1988. Bernard. She paused. She said you were outside that door. The kitchen was quiet around her. The table was solid under her hands, the same table, the same grain, the same joints that had not shifted in 42 years of use. She did not need to say anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. The right sentence Bernard had understood did not require anything after it. She held her tea in both hands and let the October evening come in around the edges of the window and sat at the table he had built in the first winter of their life together, which had not gone anywhere. Which would not go anywhere.